Hello and welcome to The Future is Spoken, produced by the Digital Assistant Academy. This show accompanies the Digital Assistant Academy's course entitled Voice Interaction Design. For any successful project, the collaboration between designers and developers is essential. If designers and developers have shared common goals, it leads to a successful project. In today's episode, Shyamala Prayaga speaks with Ilana Meir and Daniel Suissa from Facebook about collaboration in conversation design. Ilana Meir is a conversation designer at Facebook Reality Labs. There, she works with a cross-functional team with AR and VR technologies, namely Oculus and Portal. Ilana approaches her work with a cultural lens, first seeking to understand the cultural underpinnings of behavior in a space and then how a new product will affect them. For her contributions to the design field and voice community, Speech Technology magazine named Ilana a speech technology luminary. Daniel Suissa is a software engineer at Facebook Reality Labs, working on knowledge bases for conversational AI focusing on media-related interactions. He previously helped build the Personal Finance Manager XSeek, acquired by RetailWorks, helping young folks understand their spending and connect with their favorite local merchants. Daniel comes from a background in data representation and understanding from the IDF, where I led a team of analysts that advised military leadership on resource management and strategy. Enjoy the show.
Welcome, Daniel. Welcome, Ilana.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Shyamala.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. So, Ilana, tell us a little bit about you and how did you become a conversational designer?
So I'm a conversation designer at Facebook Reality Labs. I work on augmented reality and virtual reality technologies, namely Oculus and Portal. You cut out a little bit. Did you ask me how I became a conversation designer?
Right. Yeah. How did you get into conversation design space?
I took a circuitous route. I studied anthropology and psychology, and I still feel like I frame the world in that way, sort of the inner workings of a person and the outer workings between people. I got a master's in marketing and went into marketing for a little bit, but I wanted to be on the creative side, and I happened to meet somebody in design. So then I knew that I wanted to be a designer. I thought that I would be good at being a designer, and I wanted to be in product design. And I happened to talk to somebody in my singing group who said, hey, there's this voice designer role open at a company. And do you want to try it out? And I said, yes. So I interviewed. I loved the practice that they gave me to do as part of the interview, and the rest is history.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So I'll come to that. Let me introduce Daniel first. So Daniel, can you tell us about your background and how did you get into the conversation design space?
Yes, of course. So I started as a developer building websites for clients on a freelance basis. And then I actually found myself in the fintech and drone industry. I didn't start in conversation design, but when I joined Facebook Reality Labs, and at Facebook, you have this program where you can choose your team and you can interview with them for a few weeks. I got to know about a space called semantic knowledge systems, which is what I built at Facebook Reality Labs, also the products that Ilana mentioned. And these products, semantic knowledge systems, often interact with natural language user products. And that's really where my interface with conversation design comes in.
Amazing. It's interesting. And it's really exciting. Facebook gives you the opportunity to explore and get into the space, which is really nice because that's how you expand. So Ilana, coming back to you. So I really wanted to know from you, like, what challenges did you face, coming from a product designer background and psychology background, getting into voice design, which you have no clue about what it is, how it works. What kind of challenges did you face when you got into this space?
Well, it was rough because I was coming from being on the account manager at a B2B marketing agency to trying to be at the quirky fun side of the aisle. And with that, I had to prove myself. And I knew that from my education, I had the background in at least a small foundation in the research component. Anthropology has ethnography as their method of research, which is very similar to consumer research these days and also design research these days. They borrow a lot from ethnography. And so I knew that I had this foundation but I would need to prove myself. And that's what I heard when I was trying to get into the field is, okay, you want to be a product designer, but where's the proof that you can do this? And so I spent a lot of time, my anthropologist hat, and I thought about what is the culture of this design world? I talked to a lot of people. I learned the vocabulary. I learned the design thinking process. And then I got a contract in design research, which was amazing. It was fun, but I discovered that I didn't just like coming up with the insights and handing them off. I also wanted to make something, but I didn't have any making experience. And I spent a year in a wood shop learning how to build physical things as proof that I could do this. And then once I was in the role, I felt ready for it. They trained me for it, but I just felt like I was naturally suited to it. And I had done the work to understand what I was getting into. And so once I was there, it was like, I felt like a duck to water.
So Daniel, could you tell us a little bit more about the process you follow? How do you interact with the designers? How do you collaborate? How frequently? And those kind of things.
Well, in terms of how frequently, depends on the product. Lately I've been working a lot for consumer products. And when you do something like this, you obviously interact with the designer at the very beginning, trying to understand exactly how every edge cases in the product should look like, what kind of information needs to make it to the product, and how do you make sure that information gets there and is reliable and high quality. And then during the build process, basically wherever there's a decision to be made or a compromise to be made, that's where I loop in a designer. I think that there are other systems where you build something a little bit more fundamental about the technology, and you're trying to think ahead on how the future of this technology is and where will that be used. And that's really where you start consulting designers. And sometimes that's where the work gets even more interesting, because you're trying to envision something that doesn't exist yet, and you work together to build a new technology to enable that.
Yeah, this is all interesting insights. So you mentioned early on and very frequently kind of thing. Have you seen any benefits doing that as a designer or a developer? This is a question for both of you, like interacting or collaborating very early on with the designer and developer. Have you seen any kind of benefits, which you get out of this?
Ilana, do you want to start?
Sure. I think it's so important. So I'll give a little bit of insight into my process. Whenever I think that the process should start with, first of all, understanding your users, who are you building for? And then after that, I think it's really good for the designer to dream big. Say, what is the absolute most amazing thing I could make? And from there, the designer can do some self-editing. Okay, I know that given our systems, this is what's possible. And this takes not much time at all. And then at that point, I bring in an engineer and say, okay, I'm thinking about this. What do you think about that? And to me, it's a constant negotiation, constant discussion. But in the end, we're both creative problem solvers, and we want to make the best, coolest thing. So that's why I like to engage them early on. And it also helps for the designer to have a plan in mind. I like to share my map early on so that we can point to the same things and say, this is possible, this is not possible. And as Daniel said, there are different times after we decide on what's done where we won't need to be talking, but the line of communication is always open.
I really like that description because it emphasizes how we reference to the same information, which I think is crucial to the collaboration between designers and engineers. When you establish a common language early on, talking about a product and how it's going to look like, and sometimes you can argue for an hour about a definition of a word. So in the next few months, you won't have to argue about it anymore, and there won't be any mistakes. The extracting what's in the head of a designer for an engineer sometimes involves a lot of interpretation, because just the way that you communicate design is not the way that you communicate engineering. So, for example, very often you'll have some kind of a flow chart, but in a system, that's not how a system thinks. Not necessarily things follow one after the other. Sometimes it's a mess of data that creates all sorts of conditions. So it's really important to, when you sit early on, to really understand kind of like how a designer, or the way that a designer communicates her thoughts, translates to the way that engineers build that thought out.
I love that. So sharing common goals and making sure we are designing for the user, and there's a seamless integration. So have you also been part of any kind of user research, as a developer, or any early on testings?
Never until very recently. I've been working on a project that is very close to a consumer product, and I had to make a few decisions with very little time. So what I did is, at Facebook, we have this channel where you can communicate with a lot of people in the company, sort of like how Facebook can do that in the real world. So I posted asking, hey, I'd like to talk to some people, understanding how you interact with this kind of product. Please reach out to me if you're interested to spend about 10 minutes. And to my surprise, people would love to tell you what they think about a product. Did not realize that. And that was very enjoyable for me. And I learned a lot about it, about how varied are people's opinions about different products and how very people's habits are. And I think that's really what I learned to appreciate the work of a designer, taking all that into account and building something concise that can work for a lot of people in the right way.
Right. Yeah. Definitely. I do see the moment designers are brought into the UX process or, part of any of these processes, they start empathizing more with the designers. So there's less of a tiff and more of collaboration, which is really amazing. How little process changes can make wonders. So Ilana, I had a question for you. So you worked on voice user interface design and conversational design as well. Do you see any differences designing for a chatbot interface versus designing for a voice?
I think that often the difference between designing for scannability versus listenability, I think that's downplayed, and people think that they're very similar, but they're not. When you look at a chatbot, you're looking at the shape of words and you're reading the shape of words and you think about what's the next word that you expect. And the same thing for a voice interface, you hear maybe to, and then you expect a verb afterwards, but your eyes aren't absorbing anything. And I think that chatbots require more visual design sensibilities. But I think that they're coming together. So what I've seen is that the industry has been fragmented so far. People are going one way into chatbots or they're going another way into voice. But really, these are just different tools that a designer can use to best deliver an experience or a message or help users to accomplish their goals. So I see them coming together with the largest difference being scannability versus listenability. Also with chatbots, you have the opportunity because it is GUI, it is a graphical user interface, to present visual choices. So you can display images and have people select between multiples of that, whereas voice, you're really limited to maybe 3 options, 4 max, that people can choose from. Whereas again, with chatbots, they can leverage the graphical user interface to present more options, more ways to go.
So do you see presenting more options even for chatbot would provide any kind of like cognitive load on the user's end, trying to process too much information?
Yeah, in both scenarios and in all design, you have to think about what's going to be the most valuable to the user. And you see this on websites too, that terms and conditions are way at the bottom. And in small print, they're there if you want to reference them, but they're not as prominent as helping people achieve their primary goals. And this is where the information architecture component of conversation design comes to the fore, because you have to think about what's going to be top of mind for most of our customers, or what's going to be top of mind for the customers that we want to come back to our business, and then design your hierarchy, your information hierarchy according to those priorities.
Cool. Yeah. This is great. So tell me a little bit more about the process. So how do you ensure that whatever conversation you have designed, it's perfect, or like people are liking or people are understanding? So do you test your interfaces, and how do you do that, if so?
The first thing to do is take preventive measures to increase your likelihood of success. So as I said, you want to start with the user research. Have a good idea of who you're designing for, do that exploratory research. And this doesn't have to be a really big, expensive longitudinal study on whatever it is you're designing for. Any sort of insight can help you design a better product and increase your chances of success. So whether that's doing ethnographic research or diary studies at the beginning to understand, or if it's going online and looking at what people are saying in forums. All of these methods can help you down the line. Before launching a product, it's also good to do usability testing. And for voice, I've gotten like a little bit creative, especially working in the healthcare field where it's difficult to sign patients up to test something. So you can use people internally who are not related to your product. You just have to acknowledge the bias in that sample and see like how smooth this is. Because by the time that it gets to that point, by the time that you're almost ready to launch, the team, like Daniel and I have already been in this product for like months, and our senses are a little bit dulled to the experience. And so whatever the fresh ears and eyes are on this product, it can really help you up the quality. In terms of measurement on the other side, you can think about seeing where people tend to drop off. What did you expect to happen? How does that compare to the behavior? You can see how it affects other behaviors. So if somebody engages with you one way, are they more likely to engage with you another way? Those are all things that you can measure, but it really takes upfront exploratory research, then the evaluative research at the usability stage, and then the feedback from the data on how people are using it and signal whether they enjoy it.
Yeah, those are great points. Yeah, go ahead, Daniel. Yeah.
I wanted to add on top of that is that it's also really important to relay these thoughts to kind of like a cross-functional team. Very often, you will not be the person ensuring that people like your design, people like the product. Sometimes it will be some other person that will evaluate these things. And maybe it'll be another team that will build the tools to measure these things. So in a way that the design work definitely doesn't end at the beginning, and even not when the product is launched, it's still ongoing when the product is on the market within your organization, as you make sure that you build the right thing and whether it needs any modifications.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. It's so important. It's really important, because we all are designing for the end users. I have had times where, developers were more helpful and they were like, hey, are you thinking about this use case, or are you thinking about this data? So when we are working in a collaborative environment, there are things like there was a time I was working on an interface, and I also had the habit of like involving developers early on. So I went to one of the developer and I was like, hey, what do you think about this design? And I was just wanting to know the technical feasibility, and some of its inputs actually changed the entire direction, not from the technical standpoint, but from the user experience and the design standpoint. So do you guys collaborate to that level as a designer developer, or what kind of relation should, the designer developer have?
Well, I can give an example where at least my input changed a designer's perspective completely about a product. But definitely in a smaller scale, that happens. Sometimes you find out that something is just not possible within the time frame that you need to deliver. And when that happens, you go back and you discuss and you realize that, maybe, for example, if you have a server client architecture, right? Maybe there's something you can't do on the server and you decide to do it on the client. Well, that has some implications. And very often that'll change maybe some section of the design, but not necessarily the whole thing. Because at the end of the day, we are set up to build a product. We want to build that product. Otherwise, it's sort of a pivot. I think that in terms of how designers and engineers should collaborate when this happens, there needs to be a lot of empathy and understanding that everyone is trying to do the best thing for the user. I think that engineers would want in these situations would try to optimize for the Pareto rule, which is let's get 80% of the work done in 20% of the effort. And a designer optimizes for the best possible experience that is closest to their optimal experience. And I think it's just really important to hear out these both perspectives because they're important for the success of the end result of the product.
I love that. Yeah. Ilana, you were saying something?
Yeah, so at the beginning of my process, I said that I just imagine the greatest thing ever. And then we whittle it down to what's possible with some stretch goals. And in that process, sometimes what I imagine happening isn't at all the way the technology bends. Like it just doesn't work that way. We can't do it that way. And that's something like whenever you're working with information. So when I used to mentor a design course, we worked on recipes. And the way that the design comes out is where are you getting your recipe data from? How is that information structured? Because that's going to affect what comes before what and what you can say to a user. And that's part of the fun of being a designer, is working with the technology that you have to come up with a creative solution that's going to give the best user experience. And so in that way, I found some things out about how our technology works even for the benefit of the user. That's like, oh, great, we have this tool, we can use this, we can make a better experience. That has shifted the way that I'm thinking about something. But usually that happens early on. And as we go through the process, I like to think about it as combing it out with a finer and finer tooth comb. Like you're usually not going to encounter big problems at the end if you did your homework at the beginning. So that's how my thinking on a product can be shifted early on, as if I just don't understand at that point how the technology works and haven't incorporated it into my designs yet.
These are great points. Definitely, I feel like, I love Daniel's 80-20. Like that rule is so important and can be applied everywhere. And definitely, what you've been saying about knowing a little bit about technology definitely helps designers. Talking to you, it feels like you have seen that changes as well. Like once you know a little bit about how technology works, how are we collecting the data or any such things, you are able to create more useful, meaningful designs. So what are the best practices, based on your learnings or your experience, you guys have thought about, which will help any person getting started in this space? Daniel, why don't you start?
Well, is it okay if I answer for people trying to get into the space from a technical perspective? Because I don't think that can give advice for designers. Definitely, I think that and I'm talking specifically about the space of natural language based systems, right? Whether they'll be by voice or by chat or other ways as well, search. I think that it's really important to understand, that you are not a designer. And knowing that this, in very complex technological systems, something that requires a lot of knowledge and requires a lot of research, you need to focus on that. You need to focus on how to build something that has not necessarily been built before or have been built, but for different cases. And you're the first one building this for this application. And focus less on really what should. And I know that as engineers, we should think about the bigger picture, but in our day-to-day work, I think it's really crucial to not make any decisions based on your understanding of how natural language works, because natural language is extremely complex. And even it's more complex than the system that we work in. That's why we find all sorts of creative solutions to make it work. So that's one advice. And the other is definitely get immersed in the knowledge, meaning people who work on natural language system, on complex technical systems, tend to push barrier of knowledge forward. And there's a lot of reading to be done. And I think that sometimes that I wish I had done more, and I always beat myself up for, is that, every time you finish work, you could go online and read more about what people are doing and what kind of problems they solve. And it's easy to not do it when you're immersed in your work, but it's really crucial because we work in a space where some things today might not be relevant tomorrow.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, Ilana, what do you have to say about this?
Responding to what Daniel was saying, you said that understand that you're not a designer. And I think that designers have to communicate out often what it is that they do. And I think that's a skill in itself, is learning to put the work that you do in somebody else's terms. Our goals are aligned in some ways. As I said, we're both individually really excited by creative problem solving and want to have a great user. We want to build good things at the end. But sometimes it's a little bit, it feels like opaque. Like, what is it that you actually do? I've been in conversations where it's a bunch of engineers and me, and the engineers will say, well, we need to know what happens exactly then. And this, what about this case and that? And I say, it's okay. Just give me a couple of days and I'll get back to you and I'll have that all lined out and then we can discuss it. And so I think that sometimes it's not always clear what the role of the designer is. And it falls on the designer to say, I've got this, I'll cover this and this, and then reiterate that it'll be a collaborative process.
Interesting. Do you feel developers are the gatekeepers for some of your visions? For example, as a designer, we can go crazy and then we look for the moonshot, and some of those things may not be possible, or some of those things are too visionary for the current situation. So do you see developers being like, nope, think about now, or like putting you back on track?
It's funny you said, are they the gatekeepers for my vision? I was thinking, yes, absolutely. They make my dreams come true. And that's how I feel. Like I can imagine something, I can come up with it and talk to a bunch of people to see what needs to be factored in, but they're the ones that make it come to life. And I think that's amazing. There are some things that need to happen to translate to make sure that the designs are what gets built. And part of that is doing the usability testing. I'll go through my designs once they're built and see, is this up to my standards? Are there things that need to be changed? Was there something maybe missed that were in the design specs that were not built? I haven't ever encountered an engineer that just says no to say no. And I think that getting beyond that no is important. So is this technically not feasible? Is it the timeline that makes it not feasible? Because is this so central to the user experience that we can have a discussion at a higher level on, well, maybe we need to extend our timelines and make it easier for them? No engineer just says no. And so I try and work with that to find out what's going on, and maybe we can reprioritize. Some things are going to be heavier lifts and some things are going to be lighter lifts. And I try and have it balanced at the beginning. So as I said, like, 1 or 2 stretch goals and the rest is a light lift and we know what we're getting into. But if something comes up and it's central to the user experience and a heavy lift, and there's something else that's a heavy lift that isn't quite as central, then maybe there's some shifting around that we can do and still have a quality experience at that end.
And something about really like a gatekeeping of technology that even I encounter when I work with engineers, right? Like very often you need to do something that you work with a different team that on code that is not in your control. When I emphasize what Ilana said about that she never hears just a no. Well, when you hear an explanation, it's really good to dig into it and keep asking. And if what you hear from someone is, well, I can't do what you envision doing, then you're losing a lot of the information and what potentially you could do something adjacent to that, or potentially you could do it in the future. But really engaging with the reason and engaging with the other professionals' situation, I think that you can achieve much more.
Definitely, yeah. I definitely feel, like this is an interesting way to collaborate. And I do feel developers have a lot of inputs which can be helpful. Of course, like Ilana said, we are the visionaries and developers are the one who makes and brings things to life. So definitely it's a collaborative kind of thing. And I am all about collaboration. I believe that when we collaborate a lot, we are able to design more meaningful products. So that being said, when you are designing any conversational interfaces from the beginning, like you guys are working on a new project, right? So anything when you are starting new, what is the strategies to design? Nowadays, anything could be voice enabled. You can add chatbots for everything, right? But what kind of strategies do you ensure so that you have a better product and you're not just doing for the sake of like, okay, I need to voice enable this, I need to add a chatbot here because it is possible to do it?
Talk to marketing. This might be because of my background in marketing, but I think that they're crucial in coming up with a product that's going to be successful in the market and that's going to help tell your brand story. I think that sometimes designers can get caught in their work, and both designers and engineers, I think, get really excited about building something new and looking at opportunities and wanting to seize the opportunities. But that's where I rely on my marketing partners to say, how does this fit into the big picture? Let's think about our competitive strategy here. What is our differentiator that's not only different from everybody else, but is it defensible? And with that strategy trickles down into all the elements of design. So coming up with your persona should be aligned with your brand. This is what your customers should expect from your brand in terms of the interface and the language that you use. The sorts of experiences that you put out should be aligned with your brand as well. And so again, I lean on my cross-functional partners there to lead the way and then think about the application for my work. It also comes up on deciding not just whether it's a chatbot or whether we have a voice experience, but what particular features of that experience we decide to pursue. So if we have a list of 5 things, and 1, 3, and 5 is a cohesive, good user experience, and 2 and 4 is also a cohesive user experience, but marketing says our differentiated and defensible strategy is 2 and 4, then that's the direction that we'll decide to go.
And how much of user data or user input goes into all of this?
Well, we have the research at the beginning, again, so that ethnographic research, or you can look into what people are saying on community boards and that sort of a thing. So we have that kind of data. And then we also have historic knowledge of how people tend to behave on these types of experiences.
Interesting. And thinking about the analytics, let's say you have designed the product, or you've already started thinking about, you did mention this, Ilana, that you look at different kind of performance optimization, like what feature was used, or what maybe the utterance they've used, or how frequently they've used something, the session, and all of these kind of things. Where do you get those kind of inputs from? Does this come from your collaborative team, stakeholders, or is it something you decide?
Yeah, so like Daniel was saying before, and you were saying before, it's really important to collaborate with the people who are setting up the measurement systems to make sure that you're measuring things that are meaningful. And so that's where that collaboration comes into play.
Interesting. Yeah. Daniel, do you have to say anything in here?
I just wanted to stress that, make sure that you're measuring something meaningful. We have a mantra at Facebook saying, don't mistake motion for progress. And I think that's the line when I think about metrics.
Interesting. So in terms of the conversation design itself, when you mentioned strategy, you mentioned marketing, you mentioned brand, and, like the values, and it has to be aligned. How about the conversation copy itself? When you're writing the copy for the bot and all the different prompts or responses.
When somebody interacts with a brand, there's already a persona that they perceive. So you think about Kraft macaroni and cheese. What's that brand like? Versus, I can't think of any brands right now, but some artisanal cracker company that's going to have a different look and feel to it. And so that translates to the visual design component. So you might have a shiny box versus a matte box, muted colors versus bold colors, depending on what your brand is. And the same sort of attributes that come out in the visual design, the packaging, the experience that way, come through in the voice user interface. So in the elements of words, how often do you apologize, and how polite are you? Do you say please and thank you, or do you not say please and thank you? Everything should be consistent and in every touch point with the user. So the wording has a lot to do with the brand.
So how does that collaboration happen? Do you work with marketing to understand the brand values and create, some sort of personality? Or do you come up with the copy, or do you have someone else, who defines the standard vocabulary?
At the beginning, when a team is just getting started, they'll need to work with marketing to define the persona. But once that's in place, there will be standards of communicating in place that all designers can use. And it's important to have those standards and document those standards as well, so that everybody is consistent across experiences. So as I said, I work on a few different surfaces, and we want to have the same brand voice across those surfaces, and the same in my previous work too, that every time, especially in healthcare, the voice and the vocabulary is well tuned to the audience, and you want to make sure that's consistent, both because it's optimized for a good experience and because it does the best at demonstrating your brand and strengthening the relationship with customers.
Thank you so much. This is an interesting conversation. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Ilana.
Thanks for listening today. If you would like to post a voice comment, please go to www.witlingo.com/DAA. That's www.witlingo.com/DAA. We'd love to hear from you. Remember, you can find all the information on becoming a certified voice interaction designer, along with show notes and more, at our website, digitalassistant.academy. That's digitalassistant.academy. We encourage your feedback and questions. Be sure to get in touch by using the contact page at the Digital Assistant Academy's website. We will include the link in the show notes. In our next episode, Scott Westwater and Susan Westwater talks about voice design strategy for everyone. Until next week, take care.